So I think we can pick up where I left off. And just taking a look at what we have thus far, we have a Next.js app that's connected to a Postgres database using Prisma. We've added in auth.js, specifically the Google OAuth provider. And of course, we're using the latest version of Nextjs, Nextjs15. So we are leveraging server actions as much as possible. And so now I think we've hit a point where we're ready to begin interacting with the database. But I think I'll add a header right here and move this sign out button to the far right. That way we'll have a header, a sidebar, and the rest of the content within this particular page. So let's work on that now. Excuse me. We'll close out the side links page or component, and let's focus on this header. Close the layout out. So for this, let's just remove this text for right now. And I think we can go class name, flex, item centered, justify, end. Let's go max auto, max with screen, set it to extra large, hit save. Server going, still going. Just taking a minute to load up. Oh, last name with full order bottom. Let's go padding on the Y of 6. See what that looks like. Yeah, that'll work. And then we have the sign out button right here. And then I can just go span user email. We'll go class name. Let's just make this font light. Text can be gray. 600. We'll go leading. Let's go leading type. Hit save. There we go. So now we have the email of the logged in user and a logout button. Excuse me. And let's just go cursor pointer here. Cursor pointer. And that's a lot better. And if we go sign out, it goes to sign in with Google. Go to sign in. And configuration. Hold on 1 second. Back to sign in BTN. Make sure that's saved. Go sign in, go check the logs. Control J. Have going on here. Fetch failed. Not seeing any reason we should be running into any issues. Prisma Studio. We'll just restart everything really quickly. It's me. User. Alright, so that looks good. Actually, I shouldn't have closed that out. Hey, Dad. Still getting the error there. And we'll go back to the local host. See what we get this time. So it automatically signed us in. So I may not have had a file saved appropriately. That may have been why it didn't sign us in once we signed out. But nevertheless, we are good to go now. And it is showing the logged in user, and we have the ability to log out. So that's great. Excuse me. So now what I want to shift our focus to is the new client page and having the ability to add a client from this particular window. So let's go back to VS Code, and yep, see, we need to save this, and we can save the header. So now let's shift our focus to the new page. And on this page, let's keep this open, and we'll go to the components directory, add a folder named form. In it, we'll add a form or file, named create form.tsx. And for right now, let's just mark this use client, and we'll use the RFCE shortcut to create a component named create form. Hit save. All right, so now let's go to the page.tsx, specifically the one that is within the new directory, so that we are working on the new client page. And to start us out, we'll need to bring in a few imports. So let's do this first. Let's go ahead and bring in import create form, and we can hit save there. And we'll also need the ability to see what user is logged in. That way we can associate the user with the ability to create a post. So we'll go ahead and mark this as a asynchronous function, and we'll create a const name session and set it equal to await. And what we want to await is auth. And again, remember, if you type in AUT, you should have the ability to import it from @/auth, and just click save. And then we'll go const user email is equal to session.user.email. And just be sure to include the question marks there. And then within this window, let's just make sure that we can see the user email. So I'm just going to remove this div and replace it, of course. And we'll give this a class name of with full. And I'm just going to leave that at that. Then we'll add another div within this div. And this one will give it a class name of MX auto. And we'll go max with screen. We'll make it extra large. A little padding of 4. Hit save. Now, before we bring the form in, let's just test this out to make sure. I say, well, let's add an H1. We'll add an H1 that reads create add client page. Add, we'll call it new client page. Save, and just to style the text a little bit, we'll go font bold, make the text extra large, and we'll set the text color to gray 800. Click save, and now let's go back to our local host. And it is now reading new client page. And here we have it, and I could probably give a little bit of padding right here on the header. We'll go back to it really quickly, and we'll go padding on the X of 4. There we go. All right. So we see we're on the new client page. Now I want to make sure that we can see the logged in user. So I'm just going to add some brackets and type user email. And we see the JADAD as the logged in email of the user that's logged in. So that is working as designed. So let's remove this. And then last but not least, before we write out the server action, let's go ahead and bring in the create form that we just created. So we'll go ahead and bring that form in, close this off for right now, click save, and we see the create form listed there. This is perfect. So I'm going to remove the create form. Let's put this in a div. Actually, we don't have to do that. Let's just keep it how it was. Sorry. And we'll just give some padding in the form itself when we're ready to create it. But before we create this form, let's go ahead and take care of the action that is going to invoke the form. So in the lib directory, let's add a folder named actions. And in it, let's add a file named create client.ts. So within this page, we will have the action that is going to help us create a client within our database. So let's start out by marking this file as use server, as this will be a server-side form. And the reason we're marking it as use server is because we do intend to use this within a client-side form. So anytime you do that, you have to make sure that you set the form or the file, excuse me, as a server file. So we have the use server at the top. And what I want to bring in as well to kind of help with creating a client is Zod. Zod is basically going to be used for server validation. And we're also going to send messages back to the user depending upon what's going on by using Zod. So in the terminal, we don't have to close out the React app or Prisma, but in a separate terminal, let's go ahead and type in npm Zod, and that's ZOD. Press enter. This is going to install the Zod package. And once it is installed, we can close the terminal back out. And we'll go ahead and bring it in by typing import brackets Z. And it should come up as one of the options if you installed it properly. Import Z from Zod. We'll also need to bring in Prisma, and we'll probably use revalidate path as well, and maybe even redirect since we have a separate page, but we'll create that in just a moment. But for right now, let's go ahead and create the asynchronous function that's going to allow us to create a client. So we'll go export No, this will be a export async function, and the name of this will be create client. We'll need to pass some information into this form. What we'll be passing to it is the previous state, and that's going to be pre-state, and this is going to be unknown. And we'll also pass in some form data, and this is going to be represented by form data. So for right now, we don't need to add anything else to this function just yet. What I do want to do first is let's go ahead and take advantage of Zod and by creating the form schema that's going to allow us to safely parse the data before we send it to the database. So let's create a const name client schema, and we'll set it equal to z.object. And this is what's coming from Zod on how you create or use the Zod object to create keys and values so that you can distinguish the types for each value that you created. So we're going to say z.object, and inside of it, we want to pass in the exact same fields that we have within our schema. So we're going to pass in a name, a total, a status, and the user email. So we'll go name, and that's going to be z.string because we're passing this in as a string. And there are several methods once you press or once you add a dot after the closing parentheses. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a lot of things you could do. But what we do want to access is min, which is going to represent the minimum amount of characters that we want for a name. I'm going to set it to 1 because I know there are some very unique names out there. We don't just want to pass letters. We at least want to pass 2 letters. So I'm going to set the minimum characters to 1. I'm gonna change that to 2, sorry. And I'm just going to include name is required. Actually, we can keep it at 1. I guess somebody could be named T or D or something crazy like that. And then after name, the next field is I think it is total. TOTAL, yep. And for this one, we're going to leverage z.process, preprocesses, excuse me, preprocess. And then what we want to pass in is the value. And then we're going to say const, create a const name parsed value is equal to parse float. And we're going to say the value as a string. Then underneath this, we'll give it a return statement. TURN. We'll say is not a number. If it is not a number, then we want to parse the value. And we'll say question mark undefined or parsed value. And why is this giving me an argument for a schema was not provided? Let me see something here. That shouldn't matter. Oh, I got to complete it out. So then after this, we'll need to say z.number because that is the value that we want it to have. Sorry, that's been a while. And then we'll go required error. We'll say total is required. We'll say is, no, invalid type. Sorry, invalid type error. Yep. And we'll say total must be a number. And then we also need to make sure that it is a positive number because we don't want someone to owe us a negative number. That would imply that we possibly owe them. So we'll say total must be positive. So what this is doing is basically taking the value that we get, making sure that it is a float, and then sending some messages back to the user. So we'll say z.number. If we aren't getting a number, well, we have different response, excuse me. If it is a negative number, we'll tell the user it must be positive. If it is a string, then we'll say it's a character or something, then we'll say that it must be a number. If it is required, or if the user forgets to enter anything, then we'll come back to the user and just say, hey, a number is required. And after total, we'll add the user email, and this one can just be z.string. We don't necessarily have to pass anything back to the user on this one. Remember this, but I'm gonna put something here just in case. This really is going to be passed as a hidden input. and we'll make sure that we include it. But I guess it's still good to have it just in case we forget as we're building this out. We can get a message back. So we'll say user email is required. And then last but not least, we need to do total. No, we need to do status. So we'll say status. This is going to be a enum. So we'll say z.enum. And basically this just restricts the options. With an enum, you only get certain capabilities, and we're just restricting what status can be, excuse me. The enum is either going to be paid or unpaid. And then we can send an error. We'll say error map. This is just calling a little function. We'll say message status is either paid or unpaid. Click save. Okay, so that should care for our schema, our client schema. So now let's take advantage of it by using it within the function. So if you go to the documentation in Next.js, it will talk a little bit about mutation. Where is it? Data fetch. I think it's under server access and mutation. When you get to the Zod portion, it talks a little bit about working with forms. Consider using entries, which is a method from JavaScript, the object.form entries. And we're basically going to follow this exact same suggested code. I'm not going to bore you with going through the docs and reading it and how to interpret it and customize it for our needs. We won't do all of that. But what we will do is use this approach when validating the data within our create client action. So we'll start by creating a const named validated fields and set it equal to the client schema that we just created dot safe parse. And basically this is just reviewing the object that we've received and looping over it to validate it based on the schema that we created. And then we'll say object dot form entries is equal to form data dot entries. Then underneath this const, we'll say if no validated fields dot success, meaning that if it is not success, then we want to return a error, and it'll read error validated fields dot error dot flatten dot field errors. And I think we can just add that there. That should be fine. And then what we want is to capture this data, excuse me, we want to destructure this data from validated fields.data. So we want to destructure the name, status, the total, and the user email. And that is going to come from validated fields.data. And then before we submit this, I just want to make sure that we are getting this back from the front end. So I'm just going to I'm going to log this to the console for right now. We'll just say client info, and I'm going to go name, status, total, user email. That way I can see what we're getting back. And if we're not getting something back properly, we can go ahead and make the necessary adjustments to make sure we get it back. So what I want to do now is let's go ahead and update the create form. And with the create form, what we'll need to do is before we work on the form, let's bring in some imports. First, we'll bring in the create client function that we just created, and be sure that it's coming from @lib/actions/create client. And then we want to import the use action state hook, which is going to allow us to manage the state of our form submission so that we can show pending states and error messages, etc. We'll also create a separate button, but I'm going to do that once we've confirmed that we have it working properly. So we will need to pass some information into this form. What we'll be passing in is the logged in user email, and that's going to come from the session that's being passed to the new client page. And I'm gonna also redirect the user if if there is no session, then we'll just send a message that you must be logged in to create a post. But for right now, let's just create the interface and we'll call this user email props. And we'll say user email is a string. So now I want to pass this user email into this form, and we'll also just create a form action to create the form or to submit the client, just to make sure that it is logged into the console. So let's go ahead and turn this into a prop. So we'll add the colon and then we'll say react.fc, and we are passing in the user email props. Inside of the parentheses, we'll pass in user email. And let's go ahead and get rid of this error by passing in the user email now. So we'll say user email is equal to user email. And yep, we are getting a little error back, but we'll take care of that in just a second. Well, I mean, we can take care of it now. Basically, what this means is that you have to care for the possibility of not passing anything. And if nothing gets passed to it, we just want to say that, hey, it's going to be an empty string. So now back in the form itself, what we want to do next is work inside of the function. And we'll start by getting access to this use action state. So we'll just say the brackets are equal to the use action state. And what we want to pass into this is the function that's going to be managed by the form action. And that function is going to be create client. We've already imported. And if it's not create client, then we want to pass in null. So then we'll need to create the state variables, and we'll just keep it simple. We'll say state and form action. Click save. Now we want to create a form just to test it out to make sure that we are sending data from the front to the back. And I'm going to have a form and give it an action. And this action we're going to pass to it is form action. Very first thing I want to do is pass in the user email. So we'll go input hidden. We'll say ID is going to be user email. The name is going to be user email. The default value, let's make sure we're passing in user email. And then we'll just hit save and keep it as that. So for right now, I just want to test this out to make sure that we are, or to confirm, I should say, that we are sending data from the back to the front. And we'll add a submit button and show the pending states, and then we'll come back and care for the error messages as well in the event that the user doesn't provide all the required fields. But for right now, let's just make sure this is working. So I'm gonna go input name is gonna be name. The ID of this is gonna be name. And we'll say placeholder name. Then we'll need one for status. I think for status, we'll make this a select. I'm gonna set the ID of this to status. The name is going to be status. And for right now, I'm not going to worry about anything else. Let's just create some option, and we'll say the value for the first option is an empty string. And then we'll say select status, save, and we'll copy this and use it 2 more times. 1, 2. The first one we'll make, or the second one I should say, is paid ID. And we'll change this to paid. And then the second one will be unpaid. And we'll make this unpaid. I think that is good there. And then last but not least, let's create one for total. So we'll go input. The type for this one is going to be a number. ID is going to be total, TOTAL. The name is going to be total, TAL. And we'll put a placeholder. Make it total, TOTAL. And then for right now, we'll just create a button, type submit. And I'm going to put this in a separate file. And we'll just make it add client. Hit save. Now let's test this out just to make sure that it is working. Here we have the form, and we'll style it in just a minute, or once we confirm that we're sending it. And let's just open the terminal. And what we should see is, if I've done everything right, we should see what we send from the form show up in the terminal, just to make sure that the data is parsed and that it's coming through properly. So for name, we're gonna go Jace. Status, of course, he is unpaid. The total is 150. And I'm gonna go add client. It went away. And then as you can see, we see client info, Jace, unpaid, 150. And we have our logged in session, the username from that session. So this is working properly, sending it from the back to the front. So that looks great. I know it's a little jumbled up right there. It's probably not the easiest thing to read. Sorry. Someone's son is hanging out with friends, so I'm just needing to confirm his location. Hey, what? Give me about 3 minutes. Let me make sure he is good. Be quick, and I will be right back. Sorry about that. So now let's go ahead and complete out the functionality to create a client. So we can close this out, and we'll go back to the client. And we can remove this. So underneath the structuring of the data that we need from the validated fields.data, let's go ahead and add a try catch block. So within the try catch block, let's start by going await. And what we want to do here is establish the connection to the database. So of course, in order to interact with it, we need to leverage that Prisma function that we created earlier. So I'm gonna begin to type in Prisma, and make sure you type it in lowercase. And it should be the very first option that comes up, that comes from .. Remember, this Prisma is within the lib directory. So it is going to be 2 dots outside. Well, that represents 2 dots outside of the current folder to get back to the main directory. And then we want to leverage the model that is associated with Prisma. We have a user model that's there, but what we want is the client model. And then we'll go client.create, because we want to create, not create, a client within a database. And inside of this object, what we want to do is send the data. And the data that we want to send is the name, the status, the total, and the user email, which is the exact same data that we destructured from the validated fields.data. Excuse me, and that's basically all we need to do. And within the catch block, we want to be sure to log the error creating client. And I'll do it like this to make sure that we can see it. Then we also want to return error. The message is going to be failed to create a client. Then outside of this return, or the try catch block, I want to do 2 additional things. First, let's go in and add 2 imports. The first one is going to be revalidate path. And this is going to come from Nextjs15. And I also want to bring in redirect, which is going to come from Nextnav. And basically what we want to do is we want to revalidate the data once we've successfully created a client, and send the user back to the home page. And then we also, we want to revalidate the path, and then we want to redirect the user back to the home route, which is .. So with this should work just fine. Let's test it out. So we'll go back to localhost 3000. I'm just going to refresh the screen, and we'll add our first client. It's going to be Jace. Of course, he hasn't paid. He owes us $250, and we'll click add client. And you see that we got redirected back to the home page. So it appears that it is working. The best way to check is to go to the Prisma Studio, and I'm pretty sure we still have Prisma Studio still running. Yep, it is running on localhost 5555. So we'll just go to our browser and go to localhost 5555. And if we go to client, you'll see that we now have a client added. Here's the ID that's automatically created. Here's the name of the client, the amount that's owed, the user that submitted the client, and the status. So it appears that we have the ability to add or create a client that's being registered in our database. Now let's just work on giving this a little bit of style since we have the ability to add a client successfully. So I'm going to go back to the form, and we won't do much. We'll just change it a little bit so that it's a little more visually appealing, not in such a raw state, if you will. I'm just trying to think, how do we want to go about this? So let's just create we have this. Let's just go inside the form. We'll give it a class name of flex column. Hit save. Let me see how far this extends. BG red 200. So we see the form takes up this entire, how do we want this to look? I think what we can do is, I tell you what, before we style it, we can do it simultaneously. Let's go ahead and style it. So I think the way I'm going to do this is I'll just have name, then we'll just keep it simple. So within this initial deal, we can keep the input as is for the user email, but I'm going to highlight the input that represents the name and delete it. Then underneath the input that we already have or that we have in place that's hidden, I'm gonna add another div and paste the input that I deleted inside of it. That way this input is inside of a field. And slightly above the input, below that div, let's add a span, a spa, but span. And I'm just gonna add name there. And I think it probably makes the most sense to just do this simultaneously and not separately. So I want to add the ability to see the errors that we are getting from the database if the user forgets to add a field or puts the wrong character in a field. So slightly above the return statement and underneath the use action state const, let's create a const named get field error. And we're going to set it equal to a parentheses that has field. And this is going to be key of, and it's going to be field errors. And this is going to come to us as a string or undefined. And then what we want to say is if state, and we're getting this from the use action state hook, if state dot error and name in state dot error, what we want to do is return state dot error, and we'll say field, and outside of that bracket we'll add a question mark dot curly brackets 0 to get the first error, and then outside of it we want to return undefined, not underdog, undefined. So we're getting let me see here. It'll help if I add an interface. So we need to create the props for this. Sorry, I forgot to do that first. So outside of that interface, let's add or beneath the interface, let's add another interface named field errors. And we need a name, and this is going to be a string. Status, it's a string. Total, string. And then I don't think we necessarily need it, but I'm going to include it anyway. User email. Let's put it right here. User email, string. There we go. So now that cares for us. Sorry, I forgot to add the interface first when you are building that out. So now that we have a way to capture the errors, let's make sure that we are including that in the input so that they are being displayed back to the user in the event a field is missing. So inside of the input, I'm going to add a class name, and this will be dynamic. So we'll pass in temporal literals. I'm just going to say border, and then we'll add a $sign and curly braces, and we'll say get field error. And we want to get the error for name, and come outside of that curly bracket, add a question mark. Now we want to provide the styling if we do get an error. We want the border to be red 500, or By default, we want the border to be gray 500. And then we'll also include that we want the input to be rounded, and we'll give it a little padding of 2. Let's click save. I'm going to remove this red and let's go flex call. There we go. That looks a little better. And as you can see, if I click submit or click add client and don't have anything in the field, we get a red border. So it is working perfectly. That's great. So now I want to include the display of the actual error message that's coming from Zod within our server action. So I'm going to add another div. And in this div, we'll start by giving it an ID of name error. And we'll say area live. And this is going to be POLITE. Sorry about that. Now within the div, let's go ahead and we want to get access to the get field error. So we'll need to pass in some JavaScript. So we'll say get field error, and this is going to be for name. And we'll say and double ands, excuse me. Let's pass in a p tag. And the main thing, excuse me, we want to pass into the p tag is the JavaScript get field error. Excuse me. And we want to get the field error for name. Now let's click save and go back. We see that it is now showing name is required. Let's change the color a little bit. Let's give it a class name of text small, and we'll make the text red 500. You see that it is now showing the name is required. So that's perfect. Refresh the screen, try it again. Name is required. And that is coming from the Zod validation here. Just to show you, I'll add 3 dots or 5 dots. Click it, and you see name is required with the 5 dots. Perfect. So that is working perfectly as designed. And I'm going to give this a little bit of space. Actually, I want it here. Let's go space on the Y of 4. There we go. So these two remain together. And then now we just need to give a little styling to the status and the total, and then we'll do a separate button to add the client. So let's go ahead and update it now. So we'll go with select. Where's the select field? Right here. I'm going to copy it, place it in the div. I'm going to give this div the exact same styling as it. And I copied the span as well. So instead of it reading name, I'm just going to change it to status. And as you can see, it has status there and then select status. Now, just to give the status just a little bit of styling, we'll go with class name, and we'll set this to border. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to keep this the exact same as this. Highlight it and paste it in. There we go. So it is showing. There we go. And if we click it, we see we get the red. Perfect. So now I'm going to copy this div. It has the p tag that's going to give the error back. And I'm going to place it. Let me think here. I think this goes outside the select. I'm pretty sure. And instead of it being name error, I'm just going to name it status error. And instead of get field error, I'm going to change that to status. And we're going to change this to status. Click save. Status is either paid or unpaid. Perfect. So it is reading the error message for status. Now let's just add or update total. And we're going to do the exact same thing for it. So we'll copy this total, delete it. Went here. Just can remember where it was placed. Delete it. Add a div, paste it back in, and then we'll copy this span and the div, come back here, paste it in, and then we'll just change this to total, and we see it there. Now I'm just going to add this class name to the input, and we now see we have a message, or we see we have the red border. So now let's go back and add the div, and we'll change this from status error to total error. And we'll change this to total, and we'll change this final status to total, and we see total is required. If we make it -1, hold on, actually it was already showing it -1, Total must be positive. And if I pass in a character, it's not even letting me. Perfect. So it appears that we now have validation with errors from the back to the front using Zod. Now let's try to make sure that it still works and we didn't break anything. Let's add another client. So I'm gonna add Jada, and my baby paid me, of course. And we'll say she owed 150. That client, it redirected. We got the nice link. Let's go back to the Prisma Studio. Go to clients. We see we have 2 clients, both by the JA dad. One paid, one not paid. Jason Jada. Perfect. So now the last thing I want to do to style this form a little bit is just give this button a pending state. That way the user knows that they've clicked submit and it is pending. But you know what? We can also add a message right here. I know that I'm not using React Toastify or Hot Toast notification or anything, but we can actually send a positive message, or not positive, but a success message back to the user. So the way we would do it is by getting access to the state in the use action state hook. So underneath this button, I'm going to add a little bit of JavaScript, and we're going to say state with a question mark dot message state dot success, CCESS. If the state is success, then we want to send something back to the user. And we're going to say with a P tag, client added successfully. UCCESS fully. And then inside of this div, we'll just give it a class name and just say text green 500. Then we'll say area IA live, and this is going to be POLITE, polite. And I think that is it. Does not exist because I don't think I returned success off the top of my head in the server action. I think we need to return success in order for this to work properly. Let me see something. Let's say return. I think that would go there. Just hit save. Let me see something here. Jack, unpaid, 100. But it did take in the back end. I may come back to this one because I think I'm forgetting to send this back to the client because it should have access to success. State.success. Yep. I'm gonna come back to it because it should have access to success from just based on the state of the form, but it's okay. We'll come back to it in just a moment. No biggie. But what I do want to do first is I want to update this button so that we get a pending state whenever we are submitting the button. So for right now, I'm gonna close this out, or comment it out, I should say. And let's create a submit button. So inside of the form, let's add a file named submitbtn.tsx. And we'll go ahead and mark this as use client. We'll give it the RFCE snippet and create submit button. Save it. And let's pass it into the form. So we'll remove this button and take the shortcut submit with a capital S, and we are importing it from ./submit-button, and close it off, and we see the submit button there. So now within the submit button, main thing we want to do is bring in the ability to get the pending state for our button. And for this, I'm going to import this from React DOM. And what we'll be using is use form status. So this button is going to be reusable throughout the project. So I want to make sure that we are creating a reusable component. So of course, we'll need to pass it some props. So the first thing will be interface, and we'll just call this submit button props. I always hit the wrong bracket there. And what we want to pass in is default text, and this will be a string. And then we'll also pass in pass in pending text. And this just basically says, what is the initial text going to be? Then when it hits the pending state, what is the text going to be then? What are we going to transition to? So with this button, of course, let's turn it into a prop for this function, and we'll go React FC, and then we'll add in submit button props and pass in the default text, which is going to be submit, and the pending text by default is going to be updating. And inside of the function, we want to pass in, or we want to gain access to pending, and that's going to come from the use form status as we mentioned. So we'll go ahead and call it and then destructure out pending. Then we'll remove this div and replace it with a button. And inside of this button, basically what we want is pending with a question mark. We want to show the pending text, or if it's not pending, we want to show the default text. So now let's style the button a little bit, and we could test this now. We'll just say test unpaid 1K. You see it says updating, and it transitions us back. Now if we go back to the new client page, the form's empty, and if we go to the studio, we see the test listed there, so we know that that's working. Let's just go ahead and style this button, and that'll take care of it. So we'll go with a type of submit, SUBIMT, and we'll say disabled pending, and we'll give this a class name, and we'll need to make this dynamic. So we'll pass in temporal literals. So first we'll have the pending. Well, excuse me, let me do it like this, a little easier to read. So first we'll have the normal state. So we'll go padding on the X of 4, on the Y of 2, and we'll make the border rounded. Excuse me. And then we got a space and a $sign with brackets. And we'll say pending, meaning that this first state is going to be what we see if it is pending. So what we want is, we want the background to be, we'll make it gray 300. Then we'll say the text is going to be white, and we'll say cursor not allowed. And on the next line, if it is not pending in its resting state, we want the background to be gray 600. We'll make the text white and hit save. So now we have the submit button in place. And what we just need to do now is, we're getting the error message because it's looking for us to pass in some information. And we really don't have to pass in much, but I think what I am going to do is, it was going to look for that. So for default, we'll just go with client. And then for pending, I still just want to go with updating, or we could say adding. Let's hit save. And now we should be ready to just try this out. Back. We see the new color, and I'm gonna add Gigi, my poop, and she's definitely paid. And we'll say she owed 500. Click add. We see the change in color, state of the button, and if we check our local host, bam, we see that we have all of our clients listed in a database. So this is, have the ability to create, and it is creating based upon the user that is logged in. Next up, we'll work on displaying this data from the database and also adding in some data cards. But I think right now I'm probably going to have to make a move and go pick someone up. So I will be back later on to add the ability to create to add the ability to get all clients and display the data in a data card. So I'll see you later on. Peace. Love you, man.